This is the Population Ecology unit. If you're using our textbook, it's Chapter 56. When you're studying population ecology, you're actually studying the relationships between the individuals within a population or within a species, or you're studying the relationships of that population and their environment. So if you're looking at the population, is it hierarchical, meaning is there an alpha male and an alpha female, or are they all equal? If you're looking at the environment, do they migrate? Do they hibernate? Those are the things that we will look at in this chapter. The first thing that you need to know is what an abiotic portion of the environment is. Abiotic means not alive. So we're looking at all of those things in the environment that will influence the living things but are not alive themselves. Temperature, water, sunlight, that sort of thing. For each one of these abiotic conditions, every organism will have its optimal amount. What is the perfect temperature? What is the perfect amount of water that they need? How much sunlight do they need? What type of soil, if they're a plant, do they need? And if you're outside of that optimal range, what are you, the individual, or what are you, the population, going to do to improve it? So for an example would be temperature. If it gets too hot, what can you do to protect yourself from the heat? Do you go to the shade? Do you dig a burrow? If there isn't enough water, what do you do? Do you physiologically change so that you can conserve the water that you drink, or do you migrate to find something new? Sunlight and soil are primarily for plants, but again, it's the same thing. How do you, the individual, or how do you, the species, adapt to use what sunlight is available or what nutrients are available in your soil? As you already know, when the environment changes, that triggers natural selection. If there is a gene that leads to a beneficial trait, then the organism will change in a beneficial way to match the new environmental conditions. Those evolutionary adaptations can be what is called short-term or long-term. Now what this means is that a short-term evolutionary adaptation or a short-term environmental response is something that you can do immediately. So for example, if you're outside and the temperature goes up and it gets hot, you can respond immediately by sweating. Short-term response. A long-term response is something that you carry with you all the time. So if you look at the pictures of my two bunnies, if you look at the big fat white bunny on the left, he has a morphological, which I'll explain in a minute, a long-term evolutionary adaptation, a long-term environmental response to living in snow. That means his fur is white all the time. Okay. The bunny on the right has that same type of response, but his fur is more of a brown shade to match the dirt and the rocks where he lives. So short term is a response that occurs for just the moment. You don't sweat 24 hours a day. You only sweat for the moment that you're hot. The long-term response is something that you carry with you all the time because the environmental condition where you are occurs all the time. As I said in the previous slide, short-term responses are those things that you do for the moment. So when it gets hot, you sweat. Or if you're a reptile, you hide under a rock or in some sort of shade. A long-term response is something that you carry with you. There are physiological and morphological responses. Physiological involves the internal processes that make your body work. All those things that help you to survive. For example, if you are an elk that lives in the higher climates up in the mountains, higher elevations have less oxygen, which means that you have to have more red blood cells to move the oxygen around in your body. That would be a physiological change. You have more red blood cells than an elk at a lower elevation. Another term would be morphological. That's more of a structural, a form. So do you have thicker fur than other animals? Do you have larger ears? Do you have better eyesight? Those are morphological. They also include behavioral responses in morphological changes, even though they're not actually form and structure. So if you are an organism that migrates, if you're an organism that hibernates, those are all considered long-term responses to environmental changes. Population biologists study individual populations by focusing on 3 different areas. They're looking at the range of the population, how the individuals are spaced or how they're found within their range, and how their population's size changes over time. Does it increase, does it decrease, or does it remain static or stay the same? Populations aren't static, meaning they don't stay in the exact same place all the time. The individuals or the entire population will move into or out of an area. Sometimes they do it on purpose because they're looking for food or they're changing their habitat because of the season, and sometimes it happens by accident. They get lost during bad weather or they're run out of their own particular range by a predator. Spacing is where you find the individuals within the range. So are they all clumped together? Are they all spread out? If you know the size of the range and you know how the population is spaced within that range, you can identify the social structure and you can identify the behavior of that population. There are 3 different types of spacing patterns. The first is called random. In random spacing, the individuals don't interact very strongly with each other, meaning that once they're old enough to leave the social group or to leave their mother, they do. And they usually don't get back in touch with each other until mating season. These animals also are not tied to specific parts of their environment, meaning they don't have to stay at a water source. They can walk or fly to another one. This is pretty uncommon in nature because most living things are either tied to specific parts of their environment, specific parts of their range, or they're tied to each other socially. Uniform spacing is usually caused by resource competition. It doesn't necessarily mean that the resource is rare. It just means that once you've found it, you don't want to share it. This is usually some type of territorial behavior. For example, a seal that has his own particular stretch of beach that he will defend from others. Or in plants, you'll find underneath, say, a pine tree, nothing grows. That's because the needles that they drop have a poison in them that kills anything that grows underneath, and so they protect the resources of soil and water underneath them. If you look at the individual territories, some will be larger and some will be smaller based on the size and the strength of the individual, but if you take an average, the distance between individuals is pretty uniform. And the last one is called clump spacing. These are animals or plants that are tied to a rare resource. They are animals, say, in the African savanna that are tied to a water hole or to plants that are tied to a puddle. A lot of times also these are social interaction, flocks of birds, schools of fish. And then finally, sometimes it's because a particular part of their range is better than another. So they'll clump around that one little patch of trees that they have in their range. It's very similar to that uneven distribution of resources, but it's more that they prefer one area rather than they have to be there. Another way biologists study populations is to look at that population's survivorship. Survivorship is the percent of an original population that survives to a specific age. Meaning what they'll do is they'll look at the overall age that the oldest organism in that species gets to. And then they'll divide the age range up. How many babies are born? How many survive at, say, year 1, year 2, year 3, and so on. If you can figure out how many babies are born and how many babies survive all the way up to the final ending when there's nobody left in that particular population, then again you can learn about social structure and behavior of that population. There are 3 types of what they call survivorship curves, and those are simple, 1, 2, and 3. This graph shows all 3 survivorship curves on a single axis. The type 1 curve is shown in red, and as you can see, that would be humans. Those organisms that have a survivorship type 1 curve have a relatively low death rate for the young and pretty much throughout middle age, but the death rate increases rapidly in old age. These organisms care for their young, which is one of the reasons that they survive so well, and reproduce relatively late in life. The middle line, the blue line, is the type 2 curve. These organisms have a relatively constant death rate throughout their lives. Death could come early, so if we're looking at the birds in the middle, say from the nest being raided by a raccoon or another predator. It could come at middle age from being hunted or through disease, or it could come as old age at the end. The type 3 curve are for those organisms that produce a massive number of young. So in this picture we're looking at seeds, but it could also be fish or insects that lay hundreds or thousands of eggs. Most of these young will die very early in their life. They'll be consumed as eggs or shortly after the eggs hatch. Again, life is very difficult for these organisms, so if they manage to make it to middle age, then they have a pretty good chance of surviving all the way up until old age. These organisms get little to no care from their parents, which is one of the reasons that they die so quickly when they're young. And they also reproduce early in life because in most cases, except for plants, like the big trees, most organisms reproduce very early in life and then die very early as well. So type 1, we're looking at humans and most of the larger mammals. Type 2, we're looking at rodents and birds. And then type 3, we're looking at insects, fish, and plants. Up to this point, we've talked about how a population responds to its environment through physiological or morphological changes, how it uses its range, how it spaces itself within its range, its survivorship curves. Now we're going to talk about the actual reproductive response, and we're going to begin with biotic potential. Biotic potential is the maximum growth rate, meaning how many babies can an individual or a population make if everything in the environment is perfect. You have the exact amount of water, the exact amount of food, the exact amount of space. Everything is perfect. If you have that and you have no limitations at all, you will grow at biotic potential. Biotic potential leads to exponential growth. Because, for example, you start with 10 individuals, each one has 2 babies, then your population is 20. And then it becomes 40, and then it goes on and on and on and on. Eventually, your population will be so large that the habitat can no longer support it. You have exceeded the habitat's carrying capacity. When that happens, individuals will die and will die massively. the population will drop back below carrying capacity, meaning then there will be enough resources to support the individuals that are there. This is the formula that biologists use to calculate population growth. The R is rate of increase. That would be their biotic potential. You use that number, multiplying it by the actual number of individuals that are present in your population. The next part, K, represents carrying capacity. How many individuals can that particular habitat support? So you subtract the number of individuals that are there, and then you divide by that carrying capacity again. When you do all this math, and we will do some in class, what you get is the actual growth rate. So this formula takes biotic potential and adds in all the limitations, which would be represented by carrying capacity, to show what's really happening in the world. This is a graph of a population that has been run through that formula. The red population represents a population that is experiencing a population explosion because it's at 1.0, or basically its biotic potential. You can see that the population has shot over carrying capacity. If the graph extended farther out, you would see that line dropping back down as the environment and the population of this species comes into balance. The blue population shows a slower overall growth rate because as it gets closer to carrying capacity, it slows down. These individuals actually thrive best right at carrying capacity. Now keep in mind, this blue line isn't really perfectly straight. It represents an average. So if you looked at this line and blew it up, zoomed in, you would see the line go a little bit above and then drop a little bit below. So as the population goes over, the environment responds, there's not enough food, and it brings it back down. So this line is relatively straight when you take an average. Again, you don't have to memorize this formula. It will be provided for you, but you do need to be able to use it, and you do need to be able to interpret a graph like this when it's given to you. We're going to expand a little bit on the idea of biotic growth potential and look at what biologists call the two types of populations, the R-selected and the K-selected species. These organisms are based on how quickly they reproduce. R-selected, R being biotic potential species, are also called opportunistic, meaning that they are able to quickly take advantage of changes in the environment. If more resources are suddenly available, then they were able to reproduce very quickly and respond to that abundance. R-selected species generally have short lifespans, and they will either have a high mortality rate for the young, a high death rate, which puts them in survivorship 3, or they have a high death rate among all ages, which puts them in survivorship 2. There's a short time span between when they're young and they're old enough to breed. They produce many offspring at one time, and they will reproduce many times over their lifetime. The newborn are generally small, and there is little to no parental care. This would be bacteria, insects, which provide no care, or rodents and birds, which provide some care. The competitor or K-selected species, K being carrying capacity, are the exact opposite. They're called competitors because they are more efficient competitors for resources. And so when an abundance of resources appears, they respond, but they generally respond more slowly because everybody competes for that resource. all of the traits that are R-selected are opposite in K-selected. So we're looking at a long lifespan, a relatively low mortality rate up until you get to old age, which puts them in a type 1 survivorship curve. There's a relatively long time span between their young and when they're of breedable adult age. Breeding begins relatively late in life. They produce relatively few offspring, and there's a much longer time period between offspring. And the newborn are generally large, and there is extensive parental care. Keep in mind, though, that all organisms are designed to survive, and so they will show traits of both as resources change. So a K-selected species will grow abundantly, just like an R-selected species, if a massive amount of resources appear. An R-selected species will breed more slowly if there is a lack of resources. So keep in mind that just because you're a K-selected species on paper doesn't mean that you have to act like that all the time. We've spent a great deal of time in this chapter discussing the relationship between population size and carrying capacity. Feedback is that relationship. The environment provides the resources. The population responds by reproducing. If they are below carrying capacity, then the next generation, the resources are provided again. That would be called a feedback loop. If the next generation is too great and there's not enough resources for the individuals present, then you are creating what is called a negative feedback loop, meaning that the population size will decrease negatively, negative growth, because there are not enough resources for the size of the population. What I have just described is called a density-dependent negative feedback system. In other words, it is the population size that has caused the negative growth. Possibilities for this density-dependent feedback could be intraspecific competition, meaning that the resources are so limited that members of the same species are competing for them. That means that those individuals who are not as efficient as competitors will not breed. It could be an increase in predation. The population has grown so large that it has caught the attention of a predator that didn't know they were there before. It could be an increase in disease. There is always disease present in a population, but if the population size increases dramatically, that disease is spread more easily. And finally, it could be due to an increase in overall crowding. A crowded population is a stressed population. A stressed individual is less healthy or more aggressive. In either situation, they don't breed. All four of these possibilities are density-dependent factors that would decrease a population's growth potential and thereby decrease a population's size over time. The population growth rate can also be limited at any moment by something that's unrelated to the size of population. This is usually some kind of large but normal environmental change, like a change in temperatures between fall and winter, or a natural disaster, if you will, like a drought or a blizzard. Populations that experience density-independent feedback have what they call erratic growth patterns, because they'll have a nice, large, healthy population that drops suddenly because of the environmental change, and then it will grow rapidly back to carrying capacity, and then it'll stay there for a while, and then the environmental change will happen again, say fall to winter, and then population size will drop again. Density independent are populations that are responsive to the environment. It has nothing to do with their size. There are some populations of organisms like locusts and puffins that need to be overcrowded in order to reproduce. They require positive feedback, also called the alley effect, in order to reproduce. The growth rates for these organisms actually increase as the population size increases. So for other organisms, when the population size gets huge, they stop reproducing or they reproduce more slowly. For the organisms who require positive feedback, they need to be crowded in order for the hormones and the enzymes and the pheromones to be produced to stimulate reproduction. The last thing we're going to look at is the idea of a population pyramid. A population pyramid is a form of a bar graph that's used to identify future population size and to help determine the stability of that given population. It's divided in half by male and female, and then the population is divided into age categories. The one we're looking at is for humans. So we've got the 0 to 4 at the bottom, and then it goes up to 90, which is the typical age before humans pass away. If you look at the one on the left, you see a very wide series of bars. The larger the bars are, the more individuals there are in that age category. So for this one, individuals between 0 and 30 are a large portion of this population. That means that there are more people who are going to be able to create offspring or who are creating offspring than are dying. That makes the population growing. If you look at the middle, the declining population, those individuals who will make babies or who are making babies are smaller than those who are above, who are no longer reproducing. This means that overall the population will get smaller. If you look at the far right, the stable population, although the bars are a little larger in some places, a little smaller in others, the average of those who are upcoming to make babies and those who are no longer making babies are approximately the same. This is a stable population. If you are a biologist introducing a population, you would want it to be growing because you would want it to be filling in its habitat. If you were looking at a population that's been around for a while, you would want it to be stable, meaning that the resources and the population size are approximately the same. If you're looking at a population that is over carrying capacity, you will be looking at a declining population as it comes into balance with the environment. This is our end. We are done with Chapter 56 if you're using the textbook, Population Ecology.